And if you can't hear me in the back, let me know. My name is Bruce Najor. I'm the Associate Director of Debate at Wayne State University in Detroit, and I'm running a 3-week lab here. This is the first research lecture. Okay, we've got people here from different experience levels. So we're going to try to be encompassing, and some of this might seem like a refresher, and some of it will be new information. Okay? But the goal of this lecture is to make you go from, what do I do, to a complete card. Okay, and that involves 5 steps. It involves searching Google. It involves scanning Google for your results to find good articles to read. It involves finding a card within an article, processing that into a card, and citing and tagging the evidence for a completed card. My first question is why research? And the answer to this question is not because we need cards. You have at your fingertips a ton of cards. You can go on some of these wiki sites and get access to every debate camp's evidence in a matter of weeks. You will be able to open up speech docs and get processed, blocked out cards ready to use. So the answer to why research is not because we need cards, but it's more important than that. Does anybody have any ideas why research?
Well, to learn more about the topic and because you need unique cards that aren't like everywhere online.
Sure, yes. We research because we want to learn more about the topic and because sometimes we need updated cards. Those are all important things. Okay, I got a couple more up here. Okay, like learning more about the topic, we want to improve our knowledge of good and poor arguments. Okay, when we research, we read. When we read, we learn. And when we learn, we know what makes a good argument and what makes a bad argument. We know when a team is trying to pull a fast one on us and try to get away with an argument that's just not true. But if all we're doing is using cards somebody else cut, we don't know what's right, we don't know what's wrong, we just know what that one card says. We don't know what an overwhelming number of the literature says. It also improves our confidence because we feel better about the debate round when we know more about the arguments happening in the debate round. And improved confidence can improve your speaker points, okay, which can help you clearly, obviously. And it's the most portable of skills. We're not all going to do debate forever, okay? And research is the best thing to help you do whatever your post-debate career leads to. So you're not really getting all out of the activity if you don't do the research. Yes, you can still have cards. No, you will not win rounds, as many rounds as you could, and you will not get the most out of the activity. Okay, but let me sort of be upfront with you on this. Nothing I say in this lecture is going to make you a great researcher. Nothing anybody says is going to make you a great researcher. Okay, being a great researcher takes practice, it takes patience, it takes trial and error, it takes experience. Okay, I've been cutting cards since September of 2000. Okay, that's before a lot of you were born. Okay, and I still struggle, I still get frustrated when I can't find something. Okay, but the purpose of this lecture is to give you some tools that you can use to self-correct when you find yourself hitting that wall, when you find yourself not able to get a card that you need. Okay, to be able to correct those mistakes yourself and to move on and to get past that hurdle and to get the cards you need. Okay, so what is a card? We've been talking about cards. Anybody, what is a card?
So card is your piece of evidence. So you want to take the whole paragraph or multiple paragraphs, but you always want to start and end at like the paragraph breaks.
Sure.
And it's basically what you want to say in the debate. What the main point of the article you want to get across to your opponent is, and then you usually highlight it down or underline it.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. A card is a piece of evidence. And why do we use evidence? Why can't we just make arguments we want to make?
You have evidence supporting the things that you're saying, and that means that it will be more credible because you have somebody else, or actors. Maybe not professionals, but somebody else back there.
Yeah, and generally, the people you're cutting cards from, I should maybe say hopefully, the people you're cutting cards from are more qualified than you, okay, to make those arguments. All right? And you need qualified people to back up your claims, okay, to make them sound more credible. But more than that, Judges aren't experts either. Judges feel a lot better voting for an argument as credible if you have a good piece of evidence to back that up. So don't just assume you're not the credible person. The judge isn't the credible person either. Okay? And the last reason is that it's part of the game. Okay? And I'm not endorsing or debating this decision, but you hear decisions sometimes post-round that the judge says, you know, I just kind of have better evidence than you. You're making good args, but you just didn't have ev. Okay? It's part of the game. Evidence wins rounds. Okay? So what makes a good card? There's a couple things that make a good card. Anybody have any?
Tag citations and text.
Tag citations make a card. It's not even a card without tag citations. So a little bit more than that. I'm sorry, what's that? Current, yes. Recency can help make a good card.
It has to be from like a reputable source, not like Yahoo Answers or something.
Qualifications and source. Those are two different things that we're going to talk about, qualifications and source, but that's part of a good card. Anybody else?
It's better if it's more like for your point instead of like going back and forth and kind of like being ambiguous on the issue.
Yeah, concise and comprehensive. Okay, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can't be contradictory within the card itself.
Sure, you want to be consistent and in context. Fair? Okay. I think that covers a lot of them. I think I might have a couple more. Concise, qualified, recent. Source is a little bit different than qualifications. You might want to consider source independent of qualifications. Example, the person who wrote the argument might be very qualified, but the source might be suspect. It might just be like a publication that person posted on the internet without any other peer review. Okay, sometimes in journals, you get more peer review, which means other people are looking at it and saying this is worthy of publication. So that has another layer kind of qualification. Warrants, meaning the author backs up the claim with reasons. And data, which sometimes is a little bit different than warrants, which is the author backs up the claim with some maybe like studies, okay, that prove what the author's saying. So in that vein, sort of what makes a bad card. So obviously the opposite of everything that's like, right? That could make a bad card. But any examples? There's a couple examples of a card that could have all of those things, yet still be a bad card.
If the tag doesn't really say what's actually in the card.
Okay, that's more like a bad argument than necessarily a bad card.
It could be something that's kind of old and...
Well, that would contradict more like the recency. Okay, so it would kind of be in the opposite of that. This is a little tricky. So, but kind of over here, consistency, okay, if it's what we call a straw person, okay, it can have all those things but be a straw person. Now that in debate means something different, I think, than in any argument class you might have taken. In debate, a straw person means that the author was saying all those things that make a good card in a paragraph, and then when you get to the next paragraph, the author says, yeah, well, but I disagree with that, and here's why. Okay, so the author was making the case, the counter case, and then concludes opposite. That would be what we call straw person. Another example is it's out of context. So, example for this, if you're cutting a card and it says liberals and conservatives are coming together to pass tax reform, and you're like, sweet, uniqueness for the tax reform this thing. And then like the next paragraph it says like, in Britain, okay, and you cut it, and say tax reform will pass in the United States, that'd be out of context. Those two are big no-nos, and you don't want to do that. You want to make sure your card is not a straw person, and you want to make sure it's in context, and that it has those things that make a good card above. Okay, finding a good argument to research. Finding a good argument to research. How do you know what to research? Well, finding a good argument to research, you start by just reading. Okay, sometimes you're going to read stuff that doesn't necessarily make up a good card. That's okay. Because it gives you background information that you then get to go out and go cut cards. Okay? The other thing is, while you're researching in the very preliminary stages, you want to let arguments evolve. Okay? What that means is, let's say you're starting out researching and you want to say, I want to find some really sweet cards that my plan is good for federalism. Okay, I want to link turn to federalism. You start researching and all you're finding is links. Okay? Well, maybe that's a reason that federalism is bad. Okay? And you pivot away from the link turn and go more towards the impact term. Okay, but you got to let arguments evolve. You can't stay on one thing if it's not being fruitful. Okay, consider the counter argument. What's the counter argument? You're cutting a case name. Okay, and you go to the original case, you look it up, you see what the AF evidence says, and it might have in there some negative points. It might have in there some straw persons where the author is saying, a lot of people say X, Y, and Z. Now here's my rebuttal to that. You wouldn't cut the card that says a lot of people say X, Y, and Z, but that gives you the idea, hey, X, Y, and Z is a good argument that this author takes seriously enough to write an answer to. So I'm just going to go find authors that support X, Y, and Z, and if you read the other team's sources, you might find footnotes or references to authors, okay, or to counter-arguments. So take advantage of that. It's a good way to get off, finding places to start cards. Okay, where do you find cards? There's generally two areas. I broke them up into general access and limited access. Okay, general access is really just like Google. It's really the search engine you should be using. If you use another search engine primarily, you should probably switch to Google. There's categories of Google, so there's like Google News. There's Google Books and Google Scholars, which are not necessarily general access. It does have some things that you can get. We'll talk about those later. But I put a little asterisk next to them because they're not technically general access. And then there's things that are more limited access. Lexis, ProQuest, Time. Those are just other search engines that your library may have access to, may not have access to. So I'm really not going to talk about those things. If you do have access to those things and you'd like to get better at searching those things, that's a good thing to bring up in a smaller group session, maybe an after lab or with your lab leaders particularly. Okay, but let's talk about using Google. Okay. First thing I want to talk about is quotation marks. Okay, who here has used quotation marks to search Google? Okay, a lot of people. Who here can tell me what quotation marks do for Google?
I think it's just search for a phrase as opposed to just a word individually.
Yes, or the individual words separated. Right. So, quotation marks around federal role and education policy. That means Google will only give me results that turn up the phrase federal role as a phrase and education policy as a phrase. So if the article said federal policy, I wouldn't get that. Okay? It has to be federal role and education policy. Okay? That has pros and cons. So the pros are it really limits your search. If you're looking for a particular phrase, it's going to come up. The con is if there's a really sweet article that says federal policy instead of federal role, it's not going to come up. Okay? So be careful when you're using it. It's helpful. Okay? But no, if you're not getting the results you want, maybe it's time to get rid of those quotation marks. Okay? Another thing we can do is we can search by date. Okay? The way we do this is we select tools. I have it boxed up there. And tools will pull up a date bar, which is boxed up in red, which then you can select different dates. So within the past 24 hours, week, month, year, etc. Now, notice how I use the quotation mark and I use the date search. That's because we can permute, okay, use the debate terminology here for a minute, the different operators we're using. We can use all of these or any of these in combination. Okay, so those are some pretty simple ones. Let's get into some that you may not have used before. Okay, minus. Okay, minus is kind of what it sounds like. It excludes results. So for this example, I'm searching federal role, education policy, minus college, because college isn't part of the topic. Okay, that means if college comes up in an article, Google won't give it to me. It will not come up in my results. That, again, pros and cons. Okay? You just put a little slash mark, a little minus mark in the word, no space. Okay, around. Just like that. Google will now look for the term, because remember, quotation marks, we're permuting some of these. Federal role. Around 50 words of education policy. Okay, so if federal role comes up at the top of Google, or the top of the result, and education policy comes up at the bottom, it ain't going to give me that one. Okay, it's going to get them closer together. You can change the number in the parentheses. That expands how far away the terms can be. Okay? They don't necessarily have to be terms, they can just be words. We're using terms here for an example. Now, notice how before there's those ellipses in the result. In federal role, then any ellipses, although pre-K-12 education policy is. That's Google telling me these words are kind of far apart. Or at least they're not close enough together that they come up, you know, in that preview. But when I did the around, now look at, the administration has not offered a school choice policy proposal with any specific details to date. I'm sorry, I skipped federal role. Choice via the federal role, period. The administration has not offered any school choice policy proposal with any specific detail to date, and education policy watchers. There's that ellipses is gone. Okay, which is showing me these results are kind of closer together now. Okay, search by a file type. Notice in the search bar now, I'm keeping around 50, but now at the end, I typed in file type : PDF. That means all the results Google will send me are going to be PDFs. That's useful for debate because a lot of times if you're cutting policy proposals or policy briefs, PDFs are going to be what you want. Okay? URL, just like regular Google results, are good too, but if you want really like paper policy briefs, PDFs are good. So if you want to limit your search to that, you can limit any file type. Okay, if you want to just do PowerPoints, it would be PPT, for example. But for the purpose of debate, PDF is probably the only file type you're going to limit to. Okay, and then notice in circle, I have circled where Google was telling me these are all PDFs. Okay, so now we've limited even further. Going on, this is parentheses and or. Okay, I've sort of done two here and one. Okay, or is kind of like what it sounds like. It's saying, I can search for either education policy or education funding. It doesn't have to be education policy. It can also be education funding. The parentheses work not like a math equation. Okay? It doesn't do that first. Okay? The parentheses work by letting Google know these terms belong together. Okay, so particularly when I'm using or, I'm going to use parentheses because I don't want Google to search federal role around 50 of education policy or forget all of that stuff, just education funding. I'm trying to avoid that, so in parentheses, I let Google know, hey, I still want federal role around 50 of one of these two terms. Okay? Did you have a question somewhere over here?
Yeah, you have to put quotations on those terms. You have to put quotations on those terms.
Okay, the question was, do you have to put quotation on bold terms? You only have to put quotations on things you want searched for as a term. So if you want to just search for things generally, you don't have to use quotations. In this example, I did not use quotations around education funding. I was letting Google know, I'm happy with education policy as a term or education funding, but it could kind of be anyway. Okay? And notice how I got results, federal funds, funding, you know, etc. I circled them up there. Not necessarily education funding. Okay? Any other questions before? We got some more operators, but have I lost anybody? Yep.
I'm really confused about what the around 50 thing is.
Okay, let's sort of explain that just a little bit more. Okay, around 50 lets Google know that I want that term, federal role, around 50 or so words of that term, education policy. So Google will actually search the results for me and let me know which results, or only give me the results, that use the term federal role around 50 words of education policy. This is useful if you're just getting a ton of articles with your terms or your words very far apart, and you were particularly looking for one card or one paragraph or you know, where it was sort of close. Again, though, for all of these operators, there are pros and cons. It limits, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Okay, any other questions? There's a couple more operators here, but just want to make sure. Okay, I think I skipped one. Okay, in text. Okay, now I put education policy or in text education funding. Okay, that means the term funds or funding, anything like that, actually has to be in the text of the result. Sometimes Google will give you results of like URLs. Okay, so the term you searched is actually just sort of referenced in a URL later in the article, and that can be not super helpful. So if you use the term in text, it means it has to be in the text. And just to go back real quick, you notice how in this last result, in result 3, grants comes up? I never searched grants. Okay, but Google, when it saw education funding, it was saying, oh, you must want grants too, because funding and grants, they're kind of close. So I'm going to give you anything that has funding or grants. All right, in text, got rid of that. That result's no longer there. Okay, because it limited my result, it modified it, so any of those aren't coming up as quickly. Okay, the last one is just site searching. Okay, so if this is very rarely useful, okay, because a lot of times you just want general things, you don't want it from a particular site. But if you type in site, and then the site, okay, that you want, in this case Brookings, it'll only give me results from Brookings. Now, let me kind of tell you where this could be useful. If you read a card, like on your phone or something, and you meant to save it, but you didn't, and you were researching later, and you're like, I remember I read a really sweet article from the New York Times that mentioned education funding and Betsy DeVos and why she's going to cut funding from X, Y, and Z program, but I just can't remember what the article was called. But I remember those terms, and I remember it was in the New York Times. Okay, using site search for that works. Okay, that's a good limiting way if you remember some other terms. But other than that, you kind of want to keep your options open for websites. Okay, I use Brookings in this example. And notice, I think it might not show up here, but I only got one result. I combined all of the different operators we've used so far. The date, the parentheses, the quotation marks, the site, and I still ended up getting one result. Okay, but we kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller results because we kept limiting the search. Okay, so that's some operator techniques for Google. Okay, the more comfortable you feel with using Google, the more operators you can use. But if you're just kind of starting off, okay, you probably want to keep it limited maybe to quotation marks when necessary, and perhaps around is one I use. But if you're just getting started, don't feel bad about not being able to master all of these operators at once, and start more generally so you can get more results to read. Okay? Any questions about operators, how they work? There are other ones, but they're not super debate useful. You can Google operators, search terms, and they'll come up. But those are the ones that make the most sense for debate, I think. Okay, so moving on, Google News. Okay, who here has used Google News before? Okay, a couple people. Okay, what did you use Google News for? Yep.
I just used it to find a common update.
A common update. Sure. And it was good for that? Did you find what you were looking for? Yeah. Because what Google News will do is it will limit it to news results. Okay, results from news sources. So you don't get maybe necessarily some of the blogs, although some of them kind of sneak in there sometimes. You're more limited to just actual news. This is good for, we start talking about cutting updates, politics, general updates, news sources, and siphoning out things that maybe you don't want for your updates file. Other than that, it works very similarly to Google. Don't have to change much. One thing that's sort of similar to Google News, but perhaps just a little bit different, is setting up a Google alert. Okay, so let's talk about that real quick. Setting up a Google alert. I kind of put on here the instructions. Okay, if you go to google.com/alerts. Okay? It'll pull up a page that kind of looks like this. Okay, well, after you sign in, okay, to your Gmail account, it'll pull up a page that kind of looks like this. Okay? And what Google Alerts does is it searches anytime that phrase or those words or whatever you do, whatever you put in there, comes up, Google will email you those websites, those articles. Okay? A couple recommendations. For this one I use Betsy DeVos. So Google's going to send me articles, news articles, where the name Betsy DeVos comes up. If I put a comma after that and added some things, it would limit the search term one. Okay? Recommendation, make sure it says only email you about once a day, no more than once a day, or else you'll just be getting like a ton of emails all day, Google Alerts. So you want to just kind of combine it into one email. But that's useful if you have like a politics file and you just want Google to send you all of the articles where tax reform comes up. Now that's going to be a lot of articles, so you do want to kind of limit it a little bit more from that. Okay? But it's useful for that. I kind of want to talk about Google Books real quick. Was there any questions about Google News? I went over that rather quickly, but it's very similar to Google. Okay. Google Books. Now we're kind of into the limited access areas. Okay. So for Google Books, I just go to books.google.com or I type in Google Books into Google. Okay. And it lets me search the text of books. Okay? Now, what could this be useful for? Well, if I can search the text of books and then in some instances preview those books, I can determine whether or not a book is useful for me to track down, buy, if it's not in the library, ask the librarian to buy if they don't have it. Okay? It lets me sort of make that judgment call. Okay? In some instances, you can even retype the result from Google Books into a card. It's sort of hard to process that into a card like you would a different kind of file, which I think they're going to go over in the Paperless lecture, but it lets me search books. Okay, so in this instance, I type into my Google Books search term, into Google Books search term, neoliberalism, education reform K through 12. Okay, maybe I'm looking for critique cards, cap cards for the topic. Okay, now I got two different types of results. I got a result that says preview available, and a result that says no preview available. And where I circled them is where it shows me the two different results. If I click on the first result with a preview, I can then search the book to get more specific results. So I know this book is about CAP and education. I want to search it for charter schools, because those are the links I'm looking for. Okay? On that left-hand side, I can search charter schools. And because this was a preview book, I can click on those blue links, those hyperlinks, and it will show me the page numbers and frequently the entire page and sometimes the pages that come before it and the pages that come after it. I can read, a few pages of that book more often than not and get a sense for the argument, get a sense if the book has what I want, maybe retype it out if it's not so long, but being careful for like typos and mistakes and stuff. And it's helpful. Okay? Now, if there was no preview available, okay, this is what it looks like. You can still search, I can still search charter schools, okay, but I'm not going to get the hyperlinks. So I can't click those pages, and I can't read that entire page. Okay, so I kind of got to guess here if that's going to have what I want or not, Less helpful, but, not totally unhelpful. Any questions about Google Books? Remember, more limited access. You're not going to have access to all those books. You're going to have to make a decision if the book's good enough. Maybe buy it. Maybe it's in your library. Maybe it's at a local library. Okay. Google Scholar, another limited access. But while you are here, you can access it. And you can access a lot of stuff in it. Okay? Just by being connected to the network, and I'm 99.9% sure this is true of being connected to the guest network, because I tried it earlier and it worked. So it should work for you when you're connected to the MSU network. If you're not connected to the MSU network, it will not work for you. Okay? So, how do we make it work for us? First thing we do is, on that Google Scholar page, when we go there, which is just scholar.google.com, we click that Settings button. Okay? And when you click that Settings button, on the left-hand side, you click Library Links. Okay? And then when you click Library Links, this page will come up. And you type in Michigan State. And then you type in the search. And then you should have two boxes that come up. One is World Link, that's general access. And the other will be Michigan State Library. Okay? This might already be clicked for you, if you're doing it now, because you're connected to the Michigan State network. But if it ever for some reason isn't, or it's not, this is how you make it so it goes back on. And if you go home and you live close to a university library and you want to connect to like whatever library is close to you and their guest network allows you to access these things, you can do that. Okay, so this is how you change it or do it differently. Now once you do that and you click Save, you can search Google Scholar just like you do Google. In this instance, I searched Millikan v. Bradley, and I think I searched like 14th Amendment, okay? And you notice how on the right-hand side, it says MSU Text Access. If you click that, you will access that journal, access that article from that journal. Okay? Google Scholar will give me journal results. Primarily, it will sometimes give me books, okay? But they will generally be peer-reviewed journal articles. Okay, so if we want to look for something, either like from a law review maybe, or an education journal, all right, while we are here, Google Scholar is a decent technique to search that. Okay, you will have fewer results than Google. Some of the articles will be dense and hard to read, okay? But they will be from more qualified people and more qualified sources, generally, okay? Another thing you can do is if you find a particularly useful article, it might be cited by like a ton of people, okay? Because that was a really sweet article that person wrote, and so a lot of people cited that journal when they wrote, not debate cited, but cited in their article, that article. It's sometimes useful to click Cited By, and that will give you all of the articles that used that original article. So if anybody ever used that article to make an argument in their article, Google will show me that article. Okay? Sometimes this is very helpful, sometimes it is less helpful. Okay? Because sometimes somebody just maybe cited it for something that's totally irrelevant to what I'm looking for, and sometimes somebody wrote an entire article about that article I was originally searching. The other thing you can do is you can change the time. Again, you know, if you want more limited date range, Google Scholar lets you do that. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, now we're done searching. We've gotten our results, and we want to choose which articles to read. Okay? And I kind of put up there an example, kind of stretched out a little bit, but a Google preview of an article that looks interesting. It's got my terms in it. They're kind of close together. And I'm thinking this might be an article that I want to cut that would be good for me. Okay? We choose which articles to read based on several things. Based on the preview that was available to me. Maybe the source. Is it a decent source? You know, you want to be pretty liberal about it, I would say. Like, when in doubt, read it. Okay, because the worst thing is it doesn't have anything and you wasted like 5 minutes reading or skimming an article, but the best thing is like it had great cards. Okay, so open it up in a new tab, your results, and read them. The way you open it up in a new tab is you just, I think it's like Control-click or something, but I just right-click and push open in a new tab. I'm sort of old school and barely know how to use a computer as it is. That's why I'm not giving the paperless lecture. Okay, so I just right-click, open in a new tab, and then read my articles. But that's useful because if I ever want to go back to my search, where my results are, it's right there. Okay, skimming an article. I'm going to be honest with you, this is probably the hardest thing to master. Okay? But when you master it, it'll make cutting cards a lot easier. Okay, so I'm going to give you some tips on how to skim an article for a card. Okay, the first thing, like I said, it takes time and practice. Okay, nobody's great at skimming right away. The next thing is you want to search the article for your search term. Okay, you used a term, federal policy, federal role, etc. Well, Control F, or Apple F, we're with the Mac people, that search term. Okay? The other thing is, look for the thesis point in each paragraph. Okay? If it's a good article, the paragraphs will have their own thesis. Okay? If you your eye can sort of gravitate towards that thesis point, you can see, okay, this is what this paragraph is about, and I can kind of see these next 3-4 paragraphs are about the same thing. Okay? But when you find that thesis point in that paragraph, in that section, it helps you skim. The last thing I would say is that if you do find something in that article where there's a pretty good card, okay, read that section. Because chances are if there's one good card, there's maybe a couple more, or the paragraph above it or the paragraph below it also has some cards. Okay, but it takes time and practice, and you will get better at skimming the more you read. So the more you read, the more background knowledge you have, the easier it will be to skim an article. Okay, processing. This is turning that section of the article into an actual card. Okay? A couple components to this. The first, and some of this will be done in the paperless lecture, but we select the parts of the article that made up the thing that we think is going to be a card. We paste it into a Word template. That'll be going over the paperless lecture. We want to paste it without formatting. Okay, so it's just sort of like a clean section. We want to compress the paragraphs, but maybe not necessarily all of the paragraphs. Compressing will be going over in the paperless lecture. Then we want to underline liberally. We want to underline a lot. Because we're going to go back and we're going to read it once we're done underlining it. We're going to want to make sure that we got everything. And that we know what the card says. And we know what the card doesn't say. And we know when the card hurts us more than it helps us, and if it does in certain places that the other team is going to take advantage of, and we prepare a counter to that. Okay? But we underline liberally, so we make sure to read the whole card. Then we highlight selectively, so the opposite. Because highlighting is what we read, to be more careful with the highlighting. And then we tag it. Okay? Tagging, sometimes easier for some people than others, but it's basically just a short summary of what the argument is that the evidence is going to support. Debaters make arguments, evidence doesn't, for the most part. Okay? So your tag is really your argument, that what you are trying to say, and the evidence is the support for that. So the tag should be brief. The judge generally flows the tag, but it should be concise. It should get the whole point across. Citations are the last thing to finish your card. Everybody sort of has their own citation process, what they want the cite to look like. It generally should have the following things: the author, first and last name, qualifications, repeat if there's more authors, the title of the article, journal, volume, issue, etc. If it came from a journal, a date, a URL, if applicable, if it came from a website, came from Lexis, and maybe just a source. Okay. Put up an example of completed cite. This is sort of my format that I use. Author name, qualifications, author name, qualifications, article title, etc. But it's not a card until it has a cite. Because the reason we have cards is to help us make our argument, because they're more qualified. And if you don't cite it, then you might as well just have said the tag and be done. Then when you read it in a round, you read the tag, You read the author's name, you read the last name, sometimes qualifications. Okay? Sort of why I like putting qualifications right after the author, because it keeps that together. You know, I don't have to hunt the site for the qualifications. If somebody asks me in cross-ex, what are the qualifications? It's kind of right there. Yeah?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it okay if you put date after author, just so that it's easier to read?
It's really okay if you do it in any order. I would generally say the author probably should go first no matter what. Okay, but whatever's comfortable for you reading, as long as it has those components. Like I said, this is just sort of the way I've always done it, but that's not, there's no one right way to do it. Your lab leaders might have a preferred way to do it. You should ask them if they have a preferred way they want you to cut cards and cite them. But if it has those things, I think you're in a good spot. Okay, we started a little bit late, so I think I have just a couple minutes to go over some of these FAQ tips and tricks that I have. Okay, but I don't have the PowerPoint. Okay, so first question I get a lot is research is boring and I lose focus. Okay, this is a pretty common problem. There's no reason to be embarrassed if you have a hard time focusing on research. But a couple tips for you. The first thing I would say is research something you like that'll keep you interested. Okay? You have to keep a schedule. So many people stop researching because they say to themselves, I'm going to research all weekend. I'm going to say Saturday and Sunday and just research all Saturday and Sunday. I'm going to have so many cards by the end of the weekend. Saturday comes, they're like, well, look, I got a lot of Saturday. I'll just wait till Saturday afternoon, then I'll start. Saturday afternoon comes and goes, Sunday evening, Saturday evening. I got all Sunday. Right? When you don't have a consistent schedule, you kind of keep putting it off and procrastinating. However, if you know every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 3 to 5, I cut cards and that's all I do, okay? You will be much more consistent and you will get much more done. 6 hours is less time in the day than Saturday and Sunday, 48 hours. But I guarantee you in those 6 hours, you will cut more cards than if you just say, I'm going to just cut cards all day. Because you won't, okay? So give yourself a schedule. Cut out your distractions. Chrome and Firefox have apps that block websites. So you can't access them for like an hour or more if you set the program. So if you know, I'm on Facebook all the time. I think I'm going to cut cards, but I just end up on Facebook. I end up on GChat. You actually block those from your browser. Okay? There's an app for Chrome, it's called Stay Focused, and an app for Firefox called Leech Block. Okay, I'm sure there's other apps for other things. Those are just the ones I'm familiar with. But it'll lock you out of websites that distract you. Another thing I would say is start with cutting cards. A lot of times people start with just collecting articles. That can be boring. Okay? I get really excited when I cut a good card. Okay? It makes me want to cut more cards. Okay? So, if I find myself being bored or distracted, I say, I'm going to cut 3 cards right now. Okay? And that motivates me to go out and continue cutting cards, particularly if they were good. But if I'm just sort of casting a net and collecting things, I'm maybe less motivated to cut cards. Another sort of thing I get with a lot of people is they say, I have a hard time getting started. Really don't know what I'm looking for. Okay, I would say think about the complete argument, map it out. What's the uniqueness, link, impact, etc. I would say use the wiki. We talked about how we don't want to use the wiki to just steal cards from other people. Okay? But it is useful. Okay? Here's a trick that I use. If I cannot find a card on something, but I know other people have that card, I will go find, Minnesota has that card, I'm going to go to Minnesota, I'm going to cut their card, but I'm going to go back and read the source. Read where it came from. And everybody will tell you, recut it from that source. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you, find that article on Google. Go create a list of search terms that make that article come up on Google. But not the only article that comes up on Google. That's not helpful. I want it to be like the 5th or 6th Google result. Because that guarantees for me that the first 5 Google results are going to have similar things that maybe are even better than that card. So I'm going to try to come up with a search term that makes that result, that card, which I know is a good card, the 5th or 6th card, the 5th or 6th Google hit. Okay? And it might take some trial and error, but once I get it, I know I'm going to have some other good cards. Another one I kind of get is, it's 5 minutes before the debate starts and I don't have cards on uranium mining shortages. And that's their advantage. I got nothing. What do I do? Okay, calm down. It's not a big deal. Okay, we can cut a card real quick. I like to use the search term like myth for these things. So I probably type in uranium mining shortages myth. I'm probably going to get a couple of results here. That get me what I want? The other thing is, either me or my partner is going to be the stronger researcher. I'm going to let the stronger researcher do the research while the partner reads their evidence, reads their source, and finds flaws in it, finds cards in it that counter their argument, that counters their card. Okay, but let the stronger researcher research the position, and the other partner actually just go to that source and get cards from that source. Bless you.
Thank you.
And the very last one I'll do is a question I get a lot, which is, I can't cut K cards. I know I need to, but I don't know how to do it. Okay? A couple recommendations for this. I would say, when you're reading an article, ask yourself, how am I going to use these paragraphs in a debate round? Is this a link argument? Is this a perm argument? Is this an alternative? Do it while you are reading. That tends to help. Another thing is start with secondary sources. Okay? Don't just go to the book that the other team was using to make their argument. Go to book reviews. Look up book reviews. What's that book they used? Okay? Now, look up a book review of that book. It'll kind of simplify it, and there might be, the book review might be critical of the book. You can get cards from them. Okay? Or companion books. Another thing is to search that author. So like Deleuze. I don't know, how do I cut Deleuze cards? Okay? I might type in like Deleuze and the political. Right? And not in quotations, but just as a general search term. And then I'll get cards that sort of map that K author into more what I'm looking for, which is how that applies to like political policies. Okay? And the other thing I'd say is look up words you don't know. Okay? There's a word that the author uses, you don't know what it means, type it into Google, it'll define it for you, and you're good to go. Alright, so is there any questions? I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the research lecture. Now you're going to move over to 117, and Tyler's going to do the paperless lecture, okay, for maths. But if that lecture's still happening, don't interrupt it. Just kind of wait outside.
Mine fell off a debate podium. Oh yeah, I remember.